Weapons, as tools for destroying our fellow humans or other animals, often provoke a certain disdain. However, it's hard to deny that without them, humans wouldn't have climbed to the top of the food chain, hunted efficiently, or defended themselves against various predators. Take, for instance, the Australopithecus, who were far removed from hunting or using advanced weapons. Their fate highlights an uncomfortable truth. On nearly all discovered Australopithecus bones, researchers have found tooth marks from leopards, hyenas, crocodiles, and other not-so-friendly members of Africa's wildlife. Some sites, like the Sterkfontein Caves, even reveal locations where big cats dragged their two-legged prey. Over the past 1.5 million years, starting with Homo habilis, humans have drastically reduced their role as prey. Yet even today, encountering a predator without a weapon will quickly remind you of our true place in the food chain. The sight of a cat-like pattern or glowing eyes in the dark captures the attention of both children and adults. A striped or spotted pelt remains a powerful symbol of dominance even today in many tribal cultures. Nature's balance is an ongoing battle for survival, where the death of one creature fuels the life of another. While this idea may be unpleasant, humans, who fish, hunt animals, and raise livestock, are essentially doing what all living things have done since the dawn of time. The key difference is that thanks to weapons and tools, we do it far more efficiently than any other species. As impressive as the claws, teeth, and strength of predators may be, a group of humans armed with spears, or even just sharpened wooden stakes, is more dangerous than any predator on Earth. Evidence from German peat bogs shows that even Heidelberg man, the ancestor of both Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, crafted throwing spears. Humans were deadly, not just because they wielded spears, but because they could strike from a distance, reducing the risk of injury during a hunt. This is something that many animals, even large predators, fear, as a serious injury could prevent them from obtaining food. For instance, lions and tigers succeed in only 10 to 20% of their hunts as it is. You can even find harsh footage on YouTube of what a crowd of humans armed with spears can achieve. In regions where hunter-gatherer tribes still exist, most animals flee as soon as they spot a human. By the Upper Paleolithic, humans had not only mastered throwing spears but had also invented a tool to enhance this skill, the atlatl, which allowed skilled hunters to hurl darts over distances of several hundred meters. The current world record for an atlatl throw is 259 meters. Based on miniature points found in South Africa's Sibudu Cave, humans may have known about bows and arrows as far back as 70,000 years ago. However, this weapon wouldn't truly come into its own until the Mesolithic. By then, hunting methods likely shifted. Humans became less selective, targeting not only herd animals but also birds and small game. Unsurprisingly, Mesolithic cave paintings are full of scenes of bow hunting. Experiments have shown that arrows tipped with stone points can inflict devastating wounds, sometimes even piercing animals as large as deer straight through. By the Neolithic, we see the first depictions of armed violence, such as those from the Levant region of Spain. It's no surprise that people in these scenes are shown with bows. The earliest organized skirmishes may very well have been shootouts. Furthermore, skeletal remains from European Upper Paleolithic sites like San Theodore, Manfora, Africa's Jebel Sahaba, and the Near Eastern Kebara show evidence of stone-tipped projectiles lodged in human bones. It's worth noting that up until the late Middle Ages, it's hard to gauge the true role of bows in ancient battles. Written records only cover the last few millennia, and when it comes to the arsenal and equipment of ancient warriors, they often lack detail. Archaeological evidence is even more frustrating since bows were typically made of wood, and their strings of organic materials rarely survive to the present day. While arrowheads have been dated to around 70,000 years ago, the oldest discovered bow, found near the Spanish town of Banyoles, is only about 7,000 years old. So when researchers uncover something like the 16th century shipwreck of the Mary Rose with over 100 bows and thousands of arrows, it's a major event for science. Meanwhile, finding a medieval spearhead or axe, even in large quantities, is unlikely to make the local news. For ancient and early medieval times, discovering even a single bow in any condition is a significant breakthrough. However, while ranged combat dominated hunting from the Paleolithic to today, fighting among humans unfolded a bit differently. With the shift to agricultural societies and the advent of metallurgy, humanity's arsenal expanded to include a variety of melee weapons, polished stone clubs and axes, bronze daggers that eventually grew into the swords we all know. these developments raise a curious question. Why did people need all this close-range weaponry when the bow, a long-established tool for ranged combat, was already widely known? In 2018, a movie called Robin Hood: Origins was released. In my opinion, the film is mediocre, but it introduces an amusing concept. It depicts a medieval world where the bow is the primary weapon, with battle scenes resembling modern combat. The bow is presented as a kind of automatic rifle of the past, prompting the question, why would anyone bother with melee combat? And while most people understand that a real bow is far less effective than what we see in the movies, many still overestimate its capabilities. Returning to early depictions of archers in combat, researcher Robert Guthrie pointed out that these images lack any representation of shields. When shields, absent during the Stone Age, first appeared, the bow's role diminished. In fact, shields, which were often made of wood and hide, were simple yet effective tools and not exclusive to advanced civilizations. Shields were made by various groups, like the Zulu people in Africa, Native American tribes, and Australians. However, the very existence of shields indicates that clashes between groups of people in this region were not exactly rare. Bows, daggers, and spears could serve both for warfare and hunting, while axes were handy for various everyday tasks. But a shield? That's specialized military gear, and its presence has always significantly undermined the effectiveness of ranged weapons until the advent of firearms. The key point is that wood and leather, unlike metal, were inexpensive materials, and crafting simple shields didn't require much investment. For instance, when we look at the grave site left after the Battle of Visby in the year 1361, we see that among more than 1,000 skeletons, the injuries mainly affected the limbs and head. This wasn't due to some robust full-metal armor; those didn't really exist at the time. A shield, especially when used in formation, provided excellent protection for the torso. It's also important to remember that from its invention until the Bronze Age, the bow was simple, made from a single piece of wood, and it seems relatively short. The oldest longbow dates back to the 4th millennium BCE and was found in South Wales. By the 3rd millennium BCE, the climate in Eastern Europe and Central Asia became drier due to increased arid conditions. Many modern steppe regions turned into semi-deserts, which, surprisingly, encouraged the rise of animal husbandry. With minimal winter precipitation, vegetation remained accessible for livestock year-round. However, there's a notable issue. Finding wood suitable for bow production wasn't always easy. One solution was to glue together shorter pieces of different types of wood, sometimes combined with bone reinforcements and sinew wrappings. This is likely how the complex composite bows of Central Asia were developed, probably out of necessity. They were labor-intensive and time-consuming to make, but they lasted longer and had slightly better performance compared to simpler designs. That said, every culture has its share of alternative historians who like to spin tales about the unparalleled greatness of their ancestors and their technology. Lately, I've noticed a trend of glorifying the composite bow of nomadic peoples. Before that, the English went through a similar phase, even coining the phrase to draw the longbow, meaning to exaggerate or tell tall tales. The English longbow was surrounded by myths even in the Middle Ages. There were storytellers in every era, and when writers like Gerald of Wales or William of Browse claimed that arrows from an English longbow could pierce oak gates or fully armored knights, saddle and horse included, and fly over a kilometer, people believed it, and some still do. When researcher Matthias Bain decided to test the killing power of an average English longbow, the results were quite intriguing. It turned out that even the cheapest armor, made from 15 to 30 layers of linen with a layer of leather, either fully blocked the arrows or minimized the damage. Surprisingly, chainmail offered less protection against arrows than this simple multi-layered fabric armor. However, chainmail made from harder metals was significantly more effective. Combining chainmail with a well-padded gambeson made fatal injuries almost impossible. Other researchers and bloggers have conducted similar tests. Sure, one could argue that their bows weren't as powerful as historical ones, but their test shots were often fired at very close range. And here's a statement that might be controversial. A solid metal cuirass over 1.5 millimeters thick was likely impervious to any bow, regardless of its strength. Still, when discussing the draw weights of English, Mongolian, and other bows, it's worth remembering that over 90% of arrowheads were broad-tipped, designed primarily to injure horses or unarmored opponents. If shields and basic armor could protect against arrows, it raises a valid question. How did the English win at battles like Poitiers, Crécy, and others? The answer lies in part in what we'd now call marketing. England did a great job promoting its victories while downplaying its defeats. For instance, just 2 months after Poitiers, a force of Anglo-Navarrese soldiers was defeated by a similar-sized French army. The English, led by Eustache d'Auberchicourt, were waiting on high ground for the French, commanded by Bracard de Fenestrange. However, the French didn't charge with cavalry, as horses were highly vulnerable to arrows and would often throw their riders when injured. Instead, the knights dismounted and advanced under the protection of their shields. According to chronicler Jean Froissart, they soon broke through the ranks of the English archers and continued onward, as the arrows couldn't penetrate their well-made armor. Froissart also describes the Battle of Pamiers, where English archers tried to weaken the French lines, but their arrows had no effect because the French were so well armored. It's worth noting that these events took place in the 14th century, before solid metal cuirasses became widespread. Later battles, such as Patay, Formigny, and Castillon, saw the deaths of around 90% of the English archers, contributing to England's eventual defeat in the war. Yet many people today, influenced by modern video games, seem to think that arrows were incredibly cheap and easily accessible. But making arrows required more than just metal. It took a lot of skilled manual labor. These craftsmen weren't serfs, and naturally they expected to earn a profit on top of covering their costs. According to surviving records from the Tower of London's armory, a standard bundle of 24 arrows cost between 10 pence in the year 1353 and 18 pence in 1399. To put it in perspective, an English archer could burn through a minute's worth of arrows at the cost of a good cow. Henry V even had to take out a loan of 10,000 marks, reportedly about $4.5 million modern US dollars, to buy arrows for his army before the Battle of Agincourt. And after being fired, many arrows became unusable if they hit something hard. Plus, to retrieve them, you had to win the battle first. A skilled archer could shoot around 10 arrows a minute, with about 50 arrows in his quiver for the whole fight. In other words, they could run out of arrows in just a few minutes, after which they effectively became light infantry and had to continue fighting in close combat. Also, don't forget that the maximum effective range of a bow, when firing in an arc, was just over 200 meters. Infantry could close that gap in a few minutes, and cavalry in less than a minute. You often hear that mastering a bow is an incredibly complex skill that takes decades to perfect. That's not entirely true. English longbowmen were typically yeomen, free peasants for whom archery was more of a hobby during their downtime from regular work. While hunting was a privilege reserved for the nobility and required precision, a longbowman's role in battle was often about firing volleys over a wide area. What mattered most were strong back muscles, not pinpoint accuracy. By the way, the tradition of training archers to shoot at long distances has survived to this day in Britain. It's called clout shooting and involves firing arrows in an arc to hit a designated area over 150 meters away. That said, if a feudal lord decided to recruit some peasants into his retinue and put them on full support, you can bet he'd pick the strongest, most skilled, and most accurate among them. Something English and Mongolian archers had in common was the use of thick, heavy arrows in battle. The heavier the arrow, the more energy it delivered, but also the less accurate it was. This suggests they were firing at areas, not specific targets. Given the wide arrowheads, they were likely aiming to inflict serious injuries on horses, which were rarely well protected, even in Europe. This isn't just my speculation. Historians like John Keegan and others have made similar observations. And while the Nomad's composite bow had slightly better performance than the English longbow, it fired shorter arrows, which was a disadvantage when it came to accuracy. Additionally, when firing in an arc, the arrow reaches its highest point and then starts to fall. The final impact energy is the energy of the arrow's descent. That's why both the English and Nomads relied on heavy arrows for this purpose. Increasing draw weight under these conditions doesn't really improve the arrow's penetration ability. It just makes the arrow fly farther so it can fall on the enemy at a greater distance. So even without diving into the technical details of limb recoil speed or impulse transfer, don't assume that increasing draw weight gives an arrow some terrifying new capabilities. Early arquebuses and muskets were slower than bows or even crossbows with draw weights in the hundreds of kilograms. They weren't particularly accurate either, but they quickly gained immense popularity. You might think it's because firearms were easier to use, but the truth is, when given the chance, Even societies with strong archery traditions in Asia and the Americas quickly switched to firearms. The sheer destructive power of a musket ball made bows obsolete. Back in my childhood and teenage years, before smartphones and computers were a thing, I was really into fishing, and I mean the kind of fishing where you actually catch fish, not just sit on the riverbank drinking. All my pocket money, whenever I got some, went toward gear. Before heading to a new fishing spot, I'd plan how it was all going to go. But, as often happens, reality had a way of throwing curveballs. Hooks and lures would snag on branches or underwater debris, the line would tangle, or if it was wound too tight on the reel, it would get warped and weak when wet. And then, of course, there was the weather ruining everything. Turns out, using a bow was probably a similar experience. Let's not forget, a bow wasn't just about the arrows. It also had a bowstring and limbs that could lose their elasticity over time, and even a tiny flaw could cause a catastrophic break at the worst possible moment. Rain and dampness were a bow's worst enemies. Moisture could weaken animal gut or sinew bowstrings, making them stretch out of shape. This, by the way, is the real reason behind those famous archer hats. Not a fashion statement, but a practical way to keep bowstrings dry during rain. At the Battle of Crécy, for example, a heavy downpour before the fight reportedly left Genoese crossbowmen with wet strings, while English archers kept theirs protected, which played a role in their victory. Heat, dryness, and even frost could also affect bows and strings. And while in video games you might pick up a bow and use it endlessly, in reality, it was far from that reliable. In most serious armies, archers would carry spare strings and sometimes even additional limbs. Bows were only strung just before combat, as leaving them under tension would wear out the limbs, making them lose their power. By now it might seem like I'm trashing the bow as a weapon, but that's not the case. Bows played a crucial role in historical conflicts and likely sent just as many people to their graves as melee weapons did. Armies with a balanced mix of archers, cavalry, and infantry were generally far more effective than those relying on just one type of unit. That said, there's something you need to understand. Unlike cavalry or infantry, archers weren't self-sufficient. Their range, rate of fire, and penetration power usually weren't enough to deal significant damage to opponents equipped with shields and even light armor. So even if we look at nomadic peoples, who had plenty of horses and skilled archers, we still see that, from as early as the first millennium BCE, their elite warriors, whether Sarmatians or later medieval Turkic and Mongol soldiers, were usually heavily armored cavalry. They carried a range of melee weapons for close combat. For them, the bow was important and often heavily used, but not a one-size-fits-all solution. While fighting enemies from a distance has always been a natural tactic for humans, dating back to the Stone Age, it took a long time to develop effective ranged combat against other humans. Even with the advent of gunpowder and muskets, ranged units didn't become entirely self-sufficient. Cold weapons, and later the bayonet, remained crucial for a long time. The invention of cartridges and automatic rifles was supposed to make soldiers incredibly efficient and self-reliant. But by then, artillery shells, mines, and bombs were already claiming the lion's share of lives on the battlefield. These days, there are two extreme viewpoints. One paints people of the past as helpless and primitive, incapable of building things like monumental structures. The other idealizes their achievements in technology. Humanity isn't a horde of bloodthirsty maniacs, though violence has always been a common way of resolving conflicts between individuals and nations alike. Wars, unfortunately, are a part of our past and present. And in warfare, people have always been pragmatic. Those who didn't use the most effective weapons and tactics lost and vanished from the political stage. The bow was a brilliant Stone Age invention, but humans aren't animals that simply succumb to arrows. We invented shields and found countless materials to craft armor. No matter how much people in the past improved ranged weapons powered by muscle energy, their technological limits never allowed them to become fully self-sufficient. That's why close combat remained relevant until the modern era, only truly fading into the background by the 20th century. As for archery, it has survived to this day as a sport and an exotic method of hunting. Alongside the spear, the bow was one of the tools that allowed humans to climb to the top of the food chain, protect themselves from predators, and to some extent, create the world we live in today. A world where our only remaining enemy is one we can't truly defeat without losing ourselves. Even though war is still a harsh reality, I'd like to believe the era of world wars is behind us, and that humanity will focus on launching spaceships into the stars, not shooting arrows at rats and frogs. Then again, call me a fatalist, but it seems that what's meant to happen will happen, and there are still plenty of challenges ahead of us.